Hola, hola amigos, Sean, brand ambassador with Spanish55 here. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about why Spanish is the easiest and most useful language that you can learn, especially if you're like me and you're from the US, but even if you're from outside the US, okay? So I've got 6 points that I'm gonna go over to explain why. Punto número uno, point number one is that it's the same alphabet as English, basically the same alphabet, okay? There's a couple little differences, right? In Spanish, they have la ñ, for example, which is the letter that's used in like niño and niña, okay? Boy and girl. And then there's a couple letters like la doble L and la doble R, which can be a little bit difficult to pronounce for native English speakers, right? The double L and the double R sounds, okay? But in general, it's basically the same alphabet, okay? This is very different than like, well, Russian has a somewhat different alphabet. Arabic and Chinese, Korean have totally different alphabets, okay? It's very different, and it takes a lot longer to learn these other languages that I just mentioned if English is your first language. With Spanish, you get a running head start. You get the same alphabet. That leads me to punto número dos. Point number two is that Spanish is a very phonetic language, okay? What do I mean by a phonetic language? It means that basically once you know what the letters are supposed to sound like, that sound never changes, okay? Once you learn all the vowel sounds and the consonant sounds, you know the alphabet, it's not gonna differ from word to word. English, for example, is actually not a very phonetic language, okay? Think about this. Think about all the different words you can think of in English that have like O-U-G-H, for example. You got like thought, through, tough. I don't know, these are just some examples of the O-U-G-H sound. A non-native English speaker probably reads that O-U-G-H and is just like, I don't know how to pronounce that in this case. And it takes a lot longer for non-native English speakers to go through that process because they're like, well, I guess I just have to memorize it. There is no pattern here, right? With Spanish, it's a more phonetic language, okay? Once you learn how, for example, the 5 basic vowel sounds, there are 5 vowels in Spanish, right? La, la, e, la, I, la, o, y la, u. Once you learn how to pronounce them, you're good. And the other huge advantage of that is that once you know Spanish pronunciation, every word sounds exactly the way it is written, okay? Not the case in English. Punto número tres. Point number 3 is that there are many cognates, okay? What are cognates? Cognates are words in 2 different languages that sound basically exactly the same, right? So an example would be like economy and economía, which I'll come back to, right? Now, there are some false cognates, okay? Words that seem like they mean the exact same thing, but they're actually different in English and Spanish. And we have a video that I believe we'll put a link to in the show notes on that. For example, right, in English and Spanish, you'll have cognates, false cognates like embarrassed and embarazado, okay? What does embarazado mean? Or embarazada, and obviously, in most cases, that means pregnant, okay? So you don't want to get confused between embarrassed and pregnant. But there are a lot of true cognates, not false cognates. And this is a huge advantage because what's going to happen in your Spanish learning journey is you're going to realize that at the beginning, some of the basic verbs in particular are difficult to memorize, okay? But then you're going to kind of hit a threshold point, okay? And at that threshold point, what's going to happen is you're going to realize, oh, now most of these more advanced words are cognates. Right? Okay, so transport, transporte, economy, economía, science, ciencia. It's very easy, okay? With so many cognates, it becomes really easy to memorize more of the words as you get more advanced. Punto número 4. Point number 4 is that in general, Spanish is pretty easily mutually understandable among all of the different dialects in the different countries. Now, there are some differences, and some people would debate me on this, and they would say, well, no, the Spanish accents and dialects are very different. But the thing is, they all understand each other. If you compare it to like a different language, okay, for example, like, I speak Arabic, for example. Arabic is a language where it's almost like you could divide it up into sub-languages because literally like someone from Morocco and someone from Iraq don't even, or from Saudi Arabia, like they don't even understand each other if they speak their local dialect. If a Cuban and a Chilean and a Mexican and a Spaniard all have a conversation, these are very distinct dialects, but they'll all understand each other. Yeah, they might have to like switch a few words here and there. They wouldn't speak super slang, okay? But the point is they all understand each other. In general, they use the same vocab for things, and it's very mutually understandable. This is an advantage because you can learn any dialect of Spanish from any country and you're going to be okay. They're going to understand you throughout the entire Spanish-speaking world. Punto número 5. Now, this is for those of you who are, from the US like I am, but in other countries as well. Spanish is everywhere. You can find it everywhere. It's so easy to practice, okay? This is why it's easy, because you can practice with so many people. I could walk out the street right now here in Minneapolis, and I'm going to find Spanish speakers within the first 2 minutes probably. You can walk out in the street in any major city in the United States, and you're going to find Spanish speakers, okay? You're going to find all sorts of establishments. I mean, if you live anywhere in the US, any city in the US, and you can't find Mexican restaurants in your city, you're not looking very hard, okay? It is everywhere. There are people to practice with everywhere, en todas partes, all right? En todas partes, everywhere. Y punto número 6 is the number of people that speak the language. This is why it's so useful, okay? Now, point number 5 was more about why it's easy, because there's a lot of people you can find to practice with, but it's also because it's so useful. There are so many native speakers. You, of course, are going to be wanting to learn a language that has a lot of native speakers. If you're, and this is just kind of like a personal point of view, right? But like if you're a parent of children and you're sending them to school, you're a native English speaker, you're saying, what language should I have my child do as an elective language course in school, and you're debating between Spanish and some other language. For me, it's almost always obviously Spanish. Obviously Spanish, especially if you live here in the United States. Now, sure, if we look at like number of native speakers, well, okay, Mandarin Chinese technically does have more native speakers. Spanish is second in the world, number of native speakers. In terms of native speakers, there's even more Spanish speakers than there are English speakers, native speakers. Now, English surpasses it total due to the number of English as a second language speakers there are, okay? But Spanish is the second most common native language in the world. And in the US right now, I mean, obviously there's discussion about maybe it becoming like an official second language at some point. But if you look at the statistics that say that there are 245 million English speakers in the US, there are 41 million Spanish speakers. 41 million, that's, 15% of the population, something like that, right? So 1 in every 7 people, I could be off on the statistics, who knows, but it's like around 1 in every 6 or 7 people that you run into in this country, if you live in the US like me, are going to speak Spanish. It's useful everywhere, okay? And if you're in the US, like the third on that list, it's like English speakers 245 million, Spanish speakers 41 million, and then the next one is Chinese at like 3 or 4 million in the US. So if you live in the US, it's obviously super easy to get access to and super important. So I think to sum things up, Español es muy fácil y muy importante, all right? It's very easy and very important, okay? I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out the link below to book your consult with Spanish 55. Y hasta pronto.